These are not ultimately institutions that you go to get an education. They're, first of all, credentialing institutions, and they're networking institutions. That's why people go to Harvard.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. My guest is a regular to this podcast. Writer William Deresiewicz comes on pretty much annually. He's a fan favorite and a favorite of mine. The first time he was on was back in 2020, and he talked about his book, The Death of the Artist, which was a deeply reported look at how artists survive, or more often do not survive, in this economy. He has since come on to talk about things like whether art has become boring, whether solitude has become obsolete, and any number of other questions that might fall into the proverbial man shaking fist at clouds category if he weren't also so curious and deeply caring about the future of intellectual life. Bill is probably best known for his 2014 book, Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. A 10th anniversary edition was just published, and given the way people are talking about higher education and university culture these days, the book is more relevant than ever. In this conversation, we talk about all of that. We also talk about the concept of the pointy kid, whether there should be affirmative action for men, whether it's better to work at Denny's than to go to college, at least for a while, and whether non-parents have any standing to talk about any of this stuff in the first place. As always, if you're a paying subscriber, you will hear the whole thing. If you are not yet a paying subscriber, I'm going to cut you off in the middle, so you might as well pony up now at meghandaum.substack.com. Enjoy the episode. Bill, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back. Is this like time number 4 now, I think?
Yeah, I think you visit the pod just about every year.
Yeah.
And there needn't be a particular occasion because there's always lots to talk about. That said, this month you are celebrating the 10th anniversary of your best-selling and very important in many corners book, Excellent Sheep.
Yes.
The Miseducation of the American Elite. Does it feel like 10 years have gone by, or?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah,
I would say
I
that.
feel like 2014 feels really far away. So a lot has happened in those 10 years. You were sounding the alarm back then about how higher education was losing the plot.
Yeah.
In 2024, it's commonplace to hear people in the educated managerial classes talk about things like how a Harvard education doesn't mean anything anymore, or even that it means something bad. It's not quite the same conversation you were initiating back then, but I suspect they're connected. So I thought we'd start by just having you tell us what connections you do see.
Oh, that's one of my favorite questions. So basically, like the political, I know it's a terrible word, but let's just say wokeness, the ideology, the whole thing, right? The connection between all of that we're talking about now. And by the way, I would like some of these educated elite members that you just talked about to like not want to send their own kids to Harvard. Because I think, it's easy to say that. I don't really believe that people are going to start sending their kids to Hillsdale, some conservative
Well, the
Catholic
University
college.
of Austin, they're going to send them to.
Yeah, right. So, I wrote this book about the, college admissions rat race, basically. That's what the book is about and what it does to kids, but really like who it produces, like what kinds of people does it produce and everything that's screwed up about that. And then, so that was 2014. It was actually the next year, 2015, that I went back to teaching, right? So I had left academia involuntarily in 2008. I'd been teaching at Yale. And in 2015, in the spring of 2015, I taught a class in your neck of the woods at one of the Claremont colleges, Scripps, with the women's college in Claremont. I taught for a semester in the spring of 2015. So this would have been the semester before what I think of as the incident, the Christakis Halloween thing at Yale, which kind of, I think, put this whole phenomenon on a lot of people's radar screens. But I saw it there at Scripps. I hadn't seen it at Yale, which, again, I left in 2008. What we were still calling then political correctness.
Right.
It's basically the same thing. It's maybe like, a later development of political correctness. But it hit me literally the first conversation I had on campus, the day I set foot on campus, because the person who was sort of there to receive me was the head of the writing center, and she was like full on, she's like a disability studies expert, and she was going around telling people that you can't say the word crazy because it's ableist.
Okay, that's the kind of thing that people don't believe when you say. Like, she was literally saying that?
She was literally saying
you were
that.
swearing under oath that this is what she was saying.
Yes. Okay, I want to be perfectly clear. She was saying a lot of stuff. I believe that particular thing I heard from someone else who was saying that she was saying that, because I was telling people, like, I just met this person. And I mean, she definitely did tell me that, when you have a student who, like, hasn't gotten with the program, and she was specifically talking about, like, guys who might cross-register from one of the other Claremont colleges that all the others are co-ed, like, well, we set them straight right away.
About what they can say?
Just about what they're supposed to think. What they're supposed to think.
Okay.
But it wasn't just her, right? So I had this class, 12 students, most of them were Scripps women. And I always encourage students to come talk to me in office hours. Those women themselves, almost all of whom identified as strong feminists, started to tell me, without my asking them, how policed they felt in their own speech and in their own behavior. One young woman told me that, like, she had been wearing moccasins the other day. Yeah, right, exactly. And somebody, like, out of the blue told her that, you can't do that, cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
Another student told me that Chinese American student, actually religious Christian. The one student who didn't identify as a strong feminist, she said that she kept her mouth shut about it. She didn't let her friends know about her religiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is, I mean, it's like it was all semester like that. I kept hearing things, hearing stories from students, hearing things from faculty members who I got to know. I'd never heard or seen any of this stuff before, and I immediately started to think, like, well, does this overturn my thesis? Because in some ways, Excellent Sheep is about how careerist these students are. Here is this upsurge of political consciousness. Does that mean that they're turning away from careerism? And it didn't take too long to figure out that, no, the two things can actually coexist quite easily. And if we're judging by actually available statistics, specifically what students major in and what kinds of careers they pursue after graduation, when they come from places like Harvard or Yale or Princeton, we see that, finance, consulting, tech dominate postgraduate paths more than they even did then. Majors like STEM and economics dominate the majors even more than they did then. So ultimately, I think this is something you already know and you've already talked about. This is just a fig leaf at a certain level. This is just a way for elites, whether they're college students or adults, to tell themselves that they're not self-serving, individualistic, elbow-throwing careerists. They're actually changing the world. They're making the world a better place.
Excellent Sheep came out in 2014. It was really well received. It was a bestseller. You were, on the lecture circuit. You were well reviewed. Did you have a sense? No, not well reviewed?
Oh, it was complicated. I mean, some of them were. Listen, I don't want to be ungrateful. And of course, like every author, I don't read my reviews except when I do. There was a really divided reaction to that book. I mean, a lot of people were appreciative, passing it around, writing to thank me, blah, 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 inviting me to talk, as you said, on campuses. Among the people who were most closely identified with those institutions, with Ivy League and comparable institutions, there was a sulfurously negative reaction. And basically, the more prestigious, the way I ended up putting it to myself was that the more prestigious the publication, the more negative the review was. So it was kind of mixed in the Daily Times. The book review, which was written by a Princeton professor, was more negative. The New Yorker wrote two negative. One was like a website thing by Joshua Rothman. And the New York Review of Books, like, it was like one of the most disgusting reviews I've ever read of any book. It was terrible. And I got all kinds of, and Steven Pinker went out of his way to, I think, of course, this is a self-serving interpretation, but I think they were very threatened by it.
Well, by way of explaining what the book is about, and it's been 10 years, so we won't spend a lot of time here, but maybe you could kind of just give us the thumbnail sketch and start by telling us the story of where the title Excellent Sheep came from.
Yes. It came from one of my students. So I taught English at Yale for 10 years. And during those 10 years, like all of the critiques that ended up forming the basis of the basis of the article that then became the basis of the book, they were kind of gathering inchoately in my mind, sort of careerism, anti-intellectualism, the sort of social exclusion. And I honestly don't even know what I said, but I was teaching a class actually on the literature of friendship, which I was trying to write an academic book about at the time. And I think I said something like, we've been talking about friendship, now we were talking about solitude. And I said, I think solitude is essential for living the life of the mind. And a student, it just kind of burst out of her. She said, so are you saying that we're all like really excellent sheep? It was this kind of moment of startled self-recognition. I'm not even sure how she got there from the conversation, but something I said triggered that in her. And I thought, well, this is perfect. This is a perfect phrase. I hadn't even thought, this was long before I thought there'd even be a book.
Right.
But, yeah.
Well, were you somebody who was interested in education? Like, did you think that you would be the sort of spokesperson for the limitations and the sort of failures of this particular part of higher ed?
I would say yes and no. Like I said, criticisms gathering inchoately in my mind. I started to think at a certain point, someday I want to write some essay like Confessions of an Ex-Professor, something like that. I already knew that I was going to be an ex-professor.
This is like saying I always dreamt about what my ex-husband would be like. You knew you were going to be an ex-professor before you started being a professor.
Well, it started to loom. My expulsion from academia was already looming on the horizon. But I didn't know I did not know that things would go this way. So I wrote an essay that happened to come out right as I was leaving. It had the very clumsy title, The Disadvantages of an Elite Education. It was published in the American Scholar, which is a relatively small quarterly. I didn't think a lot of people would see it, and I certainly didn't think students would see it. I thought maybe some fellow professors would see it and they would, recognize their experience in my critique. But it was taken up by students. It went viral. I mean, this was 2008. This was like the 5-year window when essays could go viral. Mm-hmm. And I started to hear from many students or recent graduates who wrote me very passionate and often anguished letters, emails, very long emails about what they had gone through or what they were going through and how this essay was helping them name it. So in some ways, I just fell into this role. But the whole reason I was thinking about all of this in the first place, and the whole reason that I cared about it, and the whole reason that I was somewhat better informed about what was going on with my students than a lot of my colleagues, was that I actually cared about teaching, mm-hmm. which, as I'm sure you know, is not too common in high academia and is very much discouraged because it's not a good career move to care about your students.
Yeah.
Especially before you have tenure.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was a little late to that realization because I went to a small college. I went to a small liberal arts college, and the professors did care about teaching.
Yes.
They had to. There wasn't anything else to do there but interact with the students. But yeah, I mean, I want to sort of talk about your own education. And we should say that you start the American Scholar piece that started all this, the disadvantages of an elite education, starts with an anecdote about calling a plumber.
Yes.
And you realize that you have no idea how to talk to him.
Yes.
You're 35 years old, and you say 14 years of higher education and a handful of Ivy League degrees. And there I was, stiff and stupid, struck dumb by my own dumbness. Ivy retardation, a friend of mine calls this. You say, I could carry on conversations with people from other countries and other languages, but I couldn't talk to the man who was standing in my own house. I think a lot of
Yeah.
people feel intimidated by plumbers, though, just, in your defense. I'm not sure there's much to be done about that. And he's probably making more money than a lot of professors.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people gave me shit for writing that. Like, oh, well, I can talk to the plumber. I don't know what's wrong with you. Right,
whatever.
Exactly. When I mentioned in passing before that part of what I was seeing was social exclusion, this is really what I was talking about. The class segregation that the system also involves. I mean, I grew up upper middle class. My dad was an Ivy League professor. I, existed in those circles my entire life without, I mean, I knew there were other kinds of people, but I didn't know until that moment just how disequipped I was from relating to them on a human level. And I mean, I think this is a personal diminishment for people who go through the system, but it also has obvious social, cultural, political, electoral consequences.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your own education? You talk in the book about going to Columbia and, thinking that you were supposed to, study science and I guess be a doctor. But you don't talk that much about, your high school education and sort of how you grew up, like what kind of student you were and what you thought that your education was going to consist of.
Yeah, well, I don't think that I thought about it very much. So as I said, my dad, Ivy League professor, he's an engineering professor. He was an immigrant. He was Jewish. Parents were Jewish. There was really only, I mean, me and my brother got a very specific message. It wasn't even like you hear about Indian families now, doctor or engineer. It was just doctor. I guess because my dad was already an engineer, and I guess it wasn't good enough. It was just doctor. And also because he taught at Columbia, we lived in the suburbs, and that meant that I would be able to go there for free. Yeah. There was also no question about where I was going to go. The only imperative, and I mean in general, not even just the only educational imperative, the only imperative in my childhood was to get straight A's. And I never did think about. That's why I open Excellent Sheet this way. I say, I never thought about why I was going to college, just like so many kids today. The question is never raised. It's just the thing that you do. And going to the best school that you can get into is just the thing you do. So, I mean, you didn't ask me about this yet, but I mean, this is I think how I ended up kind of wasting my time in college by, I was a science major because that was the direction I was pushed in, and I never questioned that. And I ended up kind of feeling like I had missed the chance to study what I really should have studied, which was English lit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you want to go anywhere else? Like you say, there was no discussion about it, so I guess you didn't think about it too much. But what was going on in your high school? What kind of high school did you go to? Were they obsessed with colleges? Was the town with the people driving around with the college stickers on the cars? Like, what was the climate around applying to college and going to college?
Right. I went to kind of a strange high school. I actually went to Jewish private school, to yeshivas, until I was thrown out at the end of 10th grade. There's this pattern of, expulsion. But so I only got to public school.
Wait, hang on. You were thrown out?
Well, they actually let me finish the year so that I would avoid having that mark on my record. They were compassionate about it. I was acting out. I really didn't belong there anymore. I
really?
could not stand it. Oh, yes.
Did you were a discipline problem? This was the
greatest thing that ever happened to me. I was a huge discipline problem.
Really?
Huge.
You needed ADHD medication.
Oh, tell me about it. I would have been medicated big time. Actually, I think this is a bit of a digression, but some years ago, Louis C.K., pre-cancellation, Louis C.K. once said that the reason he feels comfortable standing up on stage and creating situations where the audience feels uncomfortable is that he'd always been a discipline problem as a kid. He'd always been in trouble as a kid. So he was used to, quote unquote, being in trouble. He felt comfortable in that emotional space. That's how I feel also.
Oh, that's so...
And I think it's really served me as a writer.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
I have that, but I hate being in trouble on a personal level. I don't mind being in trouble professionally or artistically or in a
Yeah.
public sphere, but I can't stand anybody being mad at me. Like I was very well behaved as a
Uh,
child.
huh. I mean, I don't like when people I care about are mad at me.
Yeah.
I don't cause conflict with my friends, but when, yeah, I don't mind people coming at me. Yeah,
So were
but
you sorry? Were you disruptive? Wait, I think people
incredibly
are going to be
disruptive.
very surprised to hear this about you.
Incredibly
Like,
disruptive. I was like a lifer on like in the hallway in third grade. Like I was out there constantly, principal's office, parents being called, and when I got to high school, I'm like, okay, I have to keep it together now. This is high school. This is like big boy school. And for ninth grade, I managed to do that. And in 10th grade, I lost my religious faith, and I started to not completely conceal that, and also just the whole, it's a religious school, it's Orthodox Judaism, it's a pretty tightly bound environment, and I just kind of exploded basically,
hmm.
and yeah, um, although the school the school let me finish the year, but my math teacher, who had been the principal of my grade school, so he knew me. He finally, at some point, like in April, he's just like, just get out of the class. Like I'm not going to tell anyone. I just don't want you here anymore. Just go somewhere else
Oh my God,
during math.
that would have been my dream if my math teacher had said that to me, by the way, because I hated math, but okay.
Yeah, but I had to spend an hour a day, like avoiding, like I would
Yeah.
like kind of hang out in the bathroom so nobody would find me.
Oh my
Throw
gosh.
me out of
Okay.
school.
But how did you square this with like, I have to get into Columbia because that's the only place I can go?
Right. Okay, so this may be hard to believe, but I did not have a lot of anxiety about that. And it's hard to believe, maybe not for you, because you're not that much younger than me, but the system wasn't that crazy then. Like, okay, so I get to public school for 11th grade, and it was a strange situation just because there were a lot of like lower income Black and Hispanic kids, and there were a few white kids who hadn't fled public school for private school. Like that process was ongoing. So 11th grade, I get to a school that's mostly Black and Hispanic with a small bunch of white kids, some of whom were burnouts who hung out in the parking lot, and the rest of whom were elite college bound.
Oh.
So, yeah. So I think they were a lot more freaked out than I was, because I think just because I kind of knew that I was always going to go to Columbia. I could have not gotten in. That never occurred to me. But like the admissions rate at Columbia then, and by the way, Columbia was still a boys' school, was still a men's college.
Oh, when did it go co-ed? Like 84?
83.
Okay.
Yes. So like the admissions rate at Columbia was like 25% at that point.
Wow.
It wasn't like today. So it wasn't a big stressful thing, but I remember everyone else stressing out. And I also remember, and I only understood this many years later, that like, if there were like 12 or 15 other elite college bound kids, it was pretty much each kid went to a different school. Like, I think there was more than one that went to Penn and maybe more than one that went to Cornell, but it's like one at Brown, one at Dartmouth, one at Smith, one at Vassar. And it was only many years later that I realized, like, well, that's partly how admissions works.
Right.
Like, they will take one kid from any given high school.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes maybe this doesn't work quite this way anymore, but I think people forget that if you're from Alabama or something and you're like an okay student, you have a much better chance of getting into Brown than if you're from Connecticut, right?
That's right. I mean, as I report in Excellent Sheep, I spent a little bit of time on the Yale admissions committee. You actually just go in for one day as a professor. I think they just want to be able to say that professors are involved in the process. But just that one day really gave me a lot of insight, including the fact that we were just focused on quote unquote Eastern Pennsylvania, which really just meant the Philadelphia suburbs. And there was kind of a rough quota for that particular region.
Yeah.
The whole country is divided into regions. We are going to admit about 40 people from Eastern Pennsylvania. And that's how the whole thing is segmented that way.
And wait, that's what they were doing that day that
Just
you were
happened to
there?
be what
That
they were
was
doing my half
East,
of the committee that day.
Eastern Pennsylvania day.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. And we went through something like 120 files to admit about 20 kids. It was like 3 minutes per. It was like 3 minutes per. It was amazing.
And how interested were they in like the well-rounded student, the student with extracurriculars? Because that's the other thing too, is like there was, and I think this has changed dramatically. It's so much harder to get in now, no matter what. But like there was this idea, especially like when I was applying, that you could kind of beat the system if you were quote unquote interesting. Like so by the time you were doing this, like what were they looking for really?
Okay, so let me say first, just talking about how the system has evolved. So if I finished high school in 81, those kids who got into Ivy League schools would have maybe 3 APs each and 3 extracurriculars each. And by the time I was sitting on the admissions committee at Yale in 2008, we're talking like 10 or 12 each.
Yeah.
And from what I hear now, kids are taking like 14 or 15 APs, including starting junior year. They may take a whole roster of APs in junior year,
Yeah.
let alone senior year. But this business about being interesting, I mean, yes, but it's all kind of bureaucratized, right? Like, if you're interesting, but how do you demonstrate that you're interested? You demonstrate that you're interesting by doing 12 extracurriculars, which of course makes you very not interesting.
I know.
But it's just all become, everything kind of gets institutionalized, right? Like, you're really smart. How do I know? Well, you've taken all these AP courses. Does that mean that you're really intellectually developed, let alone genuinely intellectually curious? Not necessarily.
But are they looking for the kid that's like really good at one thing? I mean, how much were they caring about that by 2008? Because like somebody who's a violin prodigy or like an incredible, athlete, that's a whole other, its own category. But like somebody who's really obviously poised to achieve greatness at some point and is going to make the school look good. Like, were they taking that kind of thing into consideration? Did they care?
Right. So they specifically told me this, and other things that I've learned confirm this. They actually had a term for the kind of kid you just described. They called them pointy.
Pointy?
Not as opposed to well-rounded. They're pointy.
Oh.
Like, if you are that level, if you've won what we used to call the Westinghouse science competition, it's now the Intel science competition.
Oh.
Or you were a violin prodigy, you didn't have to have all the other stuff.
Right.
But pointy was very few kids. The other kids, well, we would have said well-rounded, but that's actually different now. And the term they use is well lopsided.
Seriously?
Sounds ridiculous, but what it means is that you're well-rounded. It's not just that you've taken 12 APs, but some are in science and some are in humanities, and it's not 12 extracurriculars all in the same category. It's again a spread. Student government. You're on a sports team. You play an instrument, but you have to be lopsided in the sense of kind of you're already heading in a particular direction. So there is a spread, but there's a concentration in one area, whether that's curricular or extracurricular. You are heading to STEM. You are a student government type. You're going to be a journalist. And you need to show that to them. So what they'll say is, we're not looking for well-rounded students. We're looking for a well-rounded class.
Right.
Yes. But yes, that's all true.
Okay, well, let's cut to where we are now. The last year we've seen a complete sort of meltdown, at least in terms of PR in the Ivy League. We saw these people like Claudine Gay, president of Harvard, testifying, really like, pulling the curtain back on a lot of the thinking at these places. I'm in this space, this heterodox space, and they love to talk about how higher education is terrible. They love to talk about how all the systems are broken. Everything is terrible. Everything is worthless. I do a podcast with Sarah Hayter, who's quite a bit younger than I am. And her feeling is that like Harvard is trash, basically. And I feel like I've become the geriatric squish on that podcast, because I'm always going, well, sort of, maybe, I don't know. And then I say, well, like, what are you going to do? Are you just not going to send your kid to college? Like, are you just not going to? And she goes, no, I'm not. I don't think I am. I don't think I am. I don't think I am. I think you do better without going. What do you make of this kind of discourse?
Yeah, I'm skeptical. But before I talk about why I'm skeptical, I also want to say that I don't know where this is going to go. I mean, there clearly seems to be more of a rebellion against elite education for reasons other than what I was writing about in Excellent Sheep than I've seen before. And like, is it really going to turn into something? I don't know. I mean, I would have been much more dismissive before, but I think it's an open question. And I think the thing I'm most impatient about are people who seem very certain that they know what's going to happen.
Well, those people do well on YouTube and on Substack and a podcast. So just FYI.
Okay. One reason I never started a podcast, but listen, part of the reason I say this is that, 10, 12 years ago, actually, in the few years before I wrote Excellent Sheep, the big conversation in higher education was about online learning, right? It was about the MOOCs, right? The massively open online courses and how they were going to put all the universities out of business. There were predictions that, within 10 or 15 years, which means now, half of colleges and universities will have gone out of business, or at some future date there'd be like 20 universities in the entire world because everyone was going to be taking Harvard and Stanford and Oxford courses online. Needless to say, none of this has happened. In fact, I recently looked, and the number of other than the for-profits like the University of Phoenix that the Obama administration sued a lot of out of business, there's actually been a slight increase in the number of four-year colleges and universities in the United States in the last 15 years. So the question is why? And what I'm saying is, probably it's going to be the same thing now with the political upheaval. The reason is that, well, there's several reasons, but I think the main reason is that these are not ultimately institutions that you go to get an education. They're, first of all, credentialing institutions, and they're networking institutions.
Yeah.
That's why people go to Harvard. I remember talking to a very obnoxious Harvard graduate. I know that's actually kind of redundant. And she said that the two things that she learned at Harvard were basically, I think she called it social poise. Like, you go into a cocktail party and you're talking to Seamus Heaney and you're holding a glass of red wine. I learned how to do that. And the connections that I made. She said, a Harvard student is always going to be able to find a job. And I thought, aside from you're a gross person, I thought, it's interesting that neither of the things that you mentioned have anything to do with learning anything. Have anything to do with books or classrooms or intellectuality. That's, so that of course is as true as it ever was.
When you see Claudine Gay up there and you hear all these people saying Harvard is terrible, I would never send my kid there. I mean, I know I just asked this question before, but is it hyperbole? I mean, do you think it's like coming from people who are truly on the political right, who never valued this stuff in the first place? Or do you think that the currency is diminishing? I mean, you could say there are a lot of people making a lot of money that never went to college in the first place. I mean, you talk about this in Excellent Sheep, even like dropping out of college is its own kind of flex, as they would say. It's a status, especially in Silicon Valley. How valuable is this? I really want to understand this.
I don't have numbers on this, but again, this is something people have been talking about for a while, ever since Zuckerberg became famous and it became known that he dropped out of, if not Bill Gates. I think there are a few people that are held up as examples. I'm very skeptical that there are a lot of people in these spheres, a lot of successful people who didn't go to college, who dropped out of college. Yes, you can always point to people who make a lot of money who didn't go to college, but if you want really, quite frankly, the only reasonably safe path to high status and high wealth, these schools are the place to go. I'm not saying it can't happen without going to them, but again, it's about learning a certain kind of social poise or social capital. It's also about networking, so that means, actually, it means both making personal connections, which are really important, but also a lot of prestige employers, the Wall Street banks, the big consultancies, they hire overwhelmingly from the most elite institutions, and in some cases won't even look at you if you didn't go to one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can tell me that that's changed, and maybe it has, but I haven't heard that it has.
I mean, I don't have any evidence that it has changed, but I see constantly, like in my particular, swirl of Twitter,
Yeah,
what crosses my view, like, oh, more and more, firms are not going to hire anyone from, I'm an employer and I'm not hiring anyone from the
yeah,
Ivy League ever again. That's it. Especially, post October 7th with the, Free Palestine movement. We
right.
do not have to get into that. It has really, I think that the sheen is off of the Ivy League brand in certain corners in a very big way. But I don't know if they're just talking a big game. Like I would never hire anybody from Harvard. It's never going to happen again.
Yeah,
Only hiring from the state schools. Like,
yeah. Well,
really?
personally, I think that would be terrific for lots of reasons, but I'll believe it when I see it, and I don't expect to see it. I really do. I mean, come on, don't, yes, like you said, it's a lot of talk. I mean, we can question whether these schools really do filter for the most valuable job skills from places like Wall Street banks. And it's not clear that they don't, but all of the people that are doing the hiring have degrees from these places. And when you have a degree from these places, you believe, I mean, I grew up like this, right? Because my dad was a Columbia professor. I grew up believing that if you didn't go to an Ivy League school, you were just an inferior form of human life. Seriously, that's the attitude. That's the attitude. And I mean, I think that's a big reason why prestige employers hire from these places, because they really think, because they went to these places and they think they're better than everybody. So they think that other people who went to these schools are better than everybody. I don't think they have a lot of respect for people who went to state schools. I think that they should. I certainly think that there's lots of talent that's kind of getting left on the table. But I don't really believe they're really going to change their practice.
Yeah. All right. I want to shift for a little bit here. This is germane, but it's a little bit of a change of topic. I think a couple of years ago when you came in here, maybe it was last year, you said you were going to be writing more about relationships. You were thinking about relationships between men and women, like sort of, dating and this, what we now are calling the mating crisis. That's not what you said you were specifically interested in, but you have been taking this on. You had a piece last
the hate
summer.
Nerds. Yes.
Should I not mention it?
You can
It's
mention
so great.
it. You go right ahead.
Okay, it's one of the great titles, Unfuckable Hate Nerds. I don't know why it's not a Netflix streaming series yet. I'm assuming it's in development.
Uh-huh.
Talking about this phenomenon of men who are living in the basement, won't get off the couch, can't get into relationships with women. It actually maps on very closely to what you're talking about in terms of education. We have a huge imbalance. We have a huge gender imbalance in higher education, in elite institutions, and everywhere else. There are way more women in these places than men. We've got concepts like hypergamy, which is the idea that women are only going to date across or up when it comes to social status. There's a whole lot of discourse going on. And I know I use the word discourse twice now in the last 10 minutes, but it's kind of...
There's a lot of discourse.
Once is enough. But it really does have a lot to do with education and status and what is considered valuable. And I'm wondering what you think about all that. Like, people are not going to college. If they do go to college, they're not necessarily meeting their spouse there the way they used to or were supposed to do.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I have anything terribly insightful to say about this.
Well, then say something not insightful.
Well, it's interesting. First of all, people don't talk about this as much as they should. I'm a little surprised to not talk about it more. A lot of especially the most elite schools try to keep their numbers of male and female fairly well balanced, which means that there's a fairly large affirmative action bonus for being a man at this point. Yes.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, it's kind of like the gender field has altered very significantly, but the values haven't changed at all, right? like, okay, women are kicking the crap out of men. They're out competing men. They're almost 60% of college graduates. It doesn't sound like they've changed what they're looking for in men very much, if what you're saying.
That was the first half of my interview with writer William Deresiewicz. To hear the rest, become a paying subscriber at megandom.substack.com. You're going to want to do it because the conversation gets kind of juicy. Lots of good stuff, including, not being parents, not having kids, and why we're talking about this in the first place. So please become a paying subscriber. Otherwise, I will tell you that William Deresiewicz has been on the show many times. He's an award-winning essayist and critic. His New York Times bestseller, Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life, was just reissued in a 10th anniversary edition. I'll be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.